The story of the North American P-51 Mustang is one of the greatest transformations in aviation history. It begins not as a legend, not as the war-winning machine we remember today, but as an aircraft that many dismissed, laughed at, and even underestimated, including Italian pilots who believed their nimble fighters and experienced aces could swat this foreign newcomer from the skies. What they didn't expect was that the Mustang, armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and an engine that changed the course of the air war, would soon carve its reputation by shredding Axis aircraft in seconds. When World War II erupted, air superiority was everything. Whoever controlled the skies could dictate the battle below, whether through reconnaissance, bombing raids, or direct air support. Germany's Luftwaffe had proven itself terrifyingly efficient in the opening years of the conflict, while Italy's Regia Aeronautica, though often overshadowed by its German ally, still fielded fast, maneuverable fighters like the Macchi C.202 and later the C.205 Veltro. These planes, with their sleek Italian design and powerful engines, were respected adversaries in the Mediterranean theater. Italian pilots, many veterans of Spain and North Africa, carried themselves with confidence, sometimes too much confidence. Against them came an aircraft born almost by accident. The P-51 Mustang was originally designed in 1940, not for the United States Army Air Forces, but for Britain. The Royal Air Force had desperately needed new fighters and approached North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40s under license. Instead, North American proposed a brand new design. Within just 117 days, the prototype Mustang took to the skies. At first, it was powered by the Allison V1710 engine, which performed decently at low altitudes, but left the plane sluggish above 15,000 feet. For bomber escort missions, that was a disaster. Early Mustangs served as reconnaissance planes and ground attack fighters, but few saw them as war winners. Italian and German pilots sneered. To them, the Mustang looked bulky, untested, and lacking the finesse of European fighters. The Macchi C.202 Folgore, with its elegant lines and Daimler-Benz engine, could outclimb and outturn most Allied aircraft of the early war years. To many Axis pilots, the idea of this American newcomer challenging them seemed laughable. The Mustang was mocked as a farm tractor with wings, powerful looking maybe, but too crude to compete with the artistry of Italian and German engineering. But then came the transformation that would change everything. Engineers discovered that by fitting the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the British Spitfire its legendary performance, the P-51 suddenly became a different beast. No longer confined to low altitudes, the new P-51B and P-51D models could reach above 30,000 feet with speed, agility, and endurance. It could escort bombers deep into Axis territory, farther than any fighter before it. And when it met enemy planes, its 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber machine guns could unleash a torrent of fire, powerful enough to cut even the most durable aircraft to pieces. Italian pilots first encountered the Mustang in the skies over Italy in 1943, after the Allied invasion of Sicily. The Mediterranean had become a vital battleground, and the Allies needed to sweep the skies clear to ensure their ground troops could advance. At first, Italian squadrons assumed the Mustang was just another Allied fighter, no different than the P-40s or Hurricanes they had faced before. In their cockpits, Italian aces joked about the clumsy American design, but the laughter quickly faded once they experienced the firepower of the Mustang up close. Imagine the scene, a formation of Macchi C.205 Veltros among Italy's finest fighters, climbing into the thin blue air above Rome to intercept Allied bombers. Their pilots are confident. They've tangled with Spitfires and Lightnings before, and they know how to exploit their aircraft's agility. But suddenly they spot a new silhouette slicing through the clouds. Sleek, long-ranged, and diving with incredible speed, the Mustang closes in. Its pilot squeezes the trigger, and 6 streams of .50 caliber fire erupt. In seconds, the sky is filled with tracers, tearing into the Italian formation. One Veltro disintegrates almost instantly, its fuel tank igniting. Another spirals downward, riddled with holes. The Mustang doesn't just win, it annihilates.
Reports spread quickly among Axis squadrons. The P-51 wasn't just another Allied plane. It was a predator, designed to escort bombers all the way from England or North Africa, fight at high altitude, and still dogfight with the best of them. Italian pilots who once laughed at its appearance began whispering in their ready rooms about its uncanny speed and firepower. Many described the encounter as being attacked by a storm of bullets, inescapable once the Mustang lined you up in its sights. Part of the terror came from those .50 caliber Brownings. Unlike rifle-caliber machine guns still used on some Axis aircraft, the Browning M2 packed devastating punch. A single burst could shred metal, rupture fuel tanks, and even tear wings apart. When mounted 6 at a time, harmonized to converge at the right distance, they created a cone of death that few planes could survive. Italian fighters, though agile, were often lightly armored. Against the Mustang's firepower, their speed and maneuverability meant little if they couldn't avoid that storm of lead. But the Mustang wasn't just deadly in combat, it was relentless in pursuit. With its Merlin engine, it could dive faster than most Axis fighters without losing control. Italian pilots, used to shaking Allied fighters in tight turns, found themselves hunted at high speeds, chased across the Mediterranean skies. Mustang pilots knew their aircraft could keep up the chase longer than almost anything the Axis fielded. Those who tried to run often discovered too late that they could not escape. For Italian pilots, the psychological impact was enormous. Confidence that had once come from mocking the Mustang turned to dread. Accounts began to circulate of entire squadrons decimated in a single encounter, of pilots who never saw the Mustang coming until the tracers lit up their cockpits. Where once they laughed, now they flew with caution, scanning the skies nervously, knowing that somewhere out there, the American fighter might be waiting. And yet the Mustang's dominance didn't just come from speed and guns. It came from strategy. Allied commanders understood that the key to victory in Europe was daylight bombing. To destroy Germany's war machine, they needed to hit factories, oil refineries, and railroads deep inside enemy territory. But unescorted bombers had been slaughtered by Axis fighters. Losses were unsustainable. The Mustang changed that equation. With its long range, it could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back, engaging any interceptors that threatened the formations. Suddenly, German and Italian pilots faced not helpless bombers, but bombers guarded by one of the most lethal fighters ever built. The skies over Italy became a proving ground. Mustang pilots fought duels against some of the best Axis aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 109, and the Macchi C.205. Each battle reinforced the same truth. The Mustang was more than a match. Italian pilots who once trusted in their aircraft's superior turning radius discovered that a Mustang could dive, climb, and shoot with equal or greater effectiveness. In combat, seconds mattered, and the Mustang's ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear in those seconds often made the difference between life and death.
By late 1943, the tide of the war was shifting. The Allied invasion of Sicily and the Italian mainland brought the Regia Aeronautica into direct confrontation with new waves of American aircraft. The skies over Naples, Salerno, and later Rome became arenas where pride, skill, and technology collided. Italian pilots still flew with passion, but the Mustang was unlike anything they had seen before. The transformation in Allied air power was so sudden and so overwhelming that it seemed almost unfair. In the early years of the war, Italy's Macchi C.200 Saetta and C.202 Folgore had fought effectively against Hurricanes and P-40 Warhawks. Italian pilots, with their daring maneuvers and Mediterranean bravado, had earned respect even from their enemies. But by the time the Mustang arrived, the gap in performance had become undeniable. The P-51B and soon the iconic P-51D swept into combat with power and grace. Its bubble canopy gave pilots unmatched visibility, its laminar flow wing reduced drag and increased efficiency, and its Merlin engine roared with over 1,400 horsepower. Against this machine, the Regia Aeronautica's finest design struggled. The Macchi C.205 Veltro, though fast and agile, lacked the same range and climb rate. The Fiat G.55 Centauro, considered Italy's best late-war fighter, was deadly but produced in too few numbers to make a difference. For Italian squadrons, the reality of facing the Mustang was brutal. Missions that once carried hope of intercepting bombers became desperate battles for survival. Bomber formations were no longer defenseless boxes of steel lumbering toward their targets. Now they were fortresses ringed by P-51s that pounced on anything daring to approach. Picture an Italian pilot in 1944 climbing from an airfield near Rome to intercept a stream of B-17s heading toward railway yards. His heart races with adrenaline, his mind focused on the glory of striking a blow against the invader. He pushes his Macchi's throttle forward, confident in its sleek Italian design. But as he nears the bomber stream, shadows dart across the sky. Mustangs, fast, determined, relentless. Before he can position himself for an attack, one has already dropped in behind him. The rattle of 6 Brownings fills the air. A burst slams into his tail, shredding control surfaces. He fights the stick, but the Mustang is merciless. In seconds, his flames erupt in flames. Stories like these spread quickly. Italian pilots who returned alive spoke in hushed tones about the speed and lethality of the Mustang. Some admitted they had never seen anything like it, the way it could dive past them then climb back with impossible power. The laughter that once echoed in ready rooms gave way to tense silence. Facing the Mustang was no longer a contest of equals, it was survival against a predator. One of the most shocking realizations for Axis pilots was the Mustang's ability to escort bombers all the way from distant bases. For years, the Axis had relied on the limits of Allied fighters to protect their skies. P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires could only escort so far before turning back. Once they left, German and Italian fighters swooped in, tearing apart bomber formations with ease. But the Mustang broke this strategy. Its extended range meant the bombers were never alone. Italian and German pilots suddenly found themselves fighting not just bombers, but swarms of Mustangs that stayed with them all the way to the target. In Italy, where fuel shortages and limited production had already weakened the Regia Aeronautica, this was devastating. The Allies could send wave after wave of heavily escorted bombers, while Italian squadrons scrambled with dwindling numbers of planes. Every encounter cost them dearly. And then there was the psychological effect. Pilots live on the edge of fear and confidence. To strap into a fighter cockpit requires belief in yourself and your machine. When that belief falters, survival becomes even harder. Italian pilots began to feel that sense of inevitability, that no matter how hard they tried, the Mustang would always have the upper hand. The 50 caliber guns were infamous. Pilots described the sound of tracers whipping past their cockpits, the thuds of bullets tearing through wings and fuselages, and the horrifying speed at which a plane could be reduced to rubble. One Italian ace, reflecting years later, admitted that once the Mustangs arrived, the war felt lost in the air. He described the Mustang as a hunter that never tired, always there, always striking. Even when they scored victories, the cost was staggering. But the Mustang's success wasn't only in Italy. Across Europe, it was rewriting the rules of air combat. German pilots flying Bf-109s and FW-190s had also underestimated the new American fighter at first. Like the Italians, they soon discovered that this was no ordinary opponent. By the time they adjusted their tactics, the Allies had seized the momentum. For the Italian Air Force, already struggling under the weight of Allied bombing, internal politics, and the eventual collapse of Mussolini's German-backed puppet state in the north, the arrival of the Mustang was one more nail in the coffin. By the summer of 1943, Italy was divided, its air force fractured between loyalists to Mussolini's German-backed puppet state in the north and those who sided with the Allies in the south. In either case, the Mustang was present, whether as an enemy or, for co-belligerent forces, as a powerful new ally. The irony was that Italian pilots who once scoffed at the Mustang's design sometimes ended up flying alongside it after the armistice. By 1944, those serving under the Allies saw firsthand what it meant to be escorted by the Mustang, to watch as its 6 Brownings cut down German fighters with ruthless efficiency. The laughter of 1942 and 1943 was gone, replaced by grim respect. Still, combat remained fierce. In northern Italy, German and Italian Social Republic squadrons continued to resist the Allied advance. Mustang pilots found themselves dueling some of the most skilled Italian aces who refused to surrender the skies. These battles were brutal, short, and often decided in seconds. A single mistake meant death. Yet even here, the Mustang's dominance shone through. The plane's legend grew not just through numbers, but through stories, pilots recounting how their Mustangs had brought them home with wings shredded, engines failing, yet still flying. Italian pilots marveled at its toughness, even as they feared its guns. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of Allied industrial might, of American engineering combined with British ingenuity. In retrospect, the laughter of Italian pilots at the Mustang's debut seems almost tragic. They had every reason to doubt it at first. Early models were unimpressive at high altitude, and Allied fighters had struggled for years against Axis aircraft. But war is not static. Technology evolves, strategies shift, and the Mustang was the embodiment of that evolution. Where once it was mocked, it became feared. Where once it was underestimated, it became unstoppable. By early 1944, the Mediterranean skies were no longer the domain of Italian confidence and German precision. They had become the proving grounds of the Mustang's supremacy. Allied air forces pressed deeper into Axis-controlled territory, striking oil depots, rail yards, and supply hubs, determined to choke off the war machine. Every mission demanded escorts, and the P-51 answered that call with a reach unmatched by any fighter before it. The Mustang's endurance stunned its opponents. Italian and German interceptors were used to watching Allied escorts peel away as fuel gauges dipped, leaving bombers exposed and vulnerable. It had been the pattern of air combat since the start of the strategic bombing campaigns. Yet, in 1944, bomber crews noticed something different. Even as their formations droned over Milan or Turin, Mustangs were still there, circling above, diving down to engage attackers, then climbing back to formation. For the Axis, this was a nightmare. The window of opportunity to strike was closing rapidly, and every attack now carried the risk of instant interception. In Rome, Italian commanders pored over reports that seemed impossible. How could a single-engine fighter escort bombers from southern Italy into the industrial heart of the north and still dogfight effectively? Skeptics suggested exaggerated claims, but frontline pilots knew better. They had seen the Mustang up close, its silhouette cutting across the sky with a grace that belied its devastating power. The Mustang's long, slender wings gave it superb high-altitude performance. Its Merlin engine, a fusion of American production and British engineering genius, maintained power where others faltered. Italian fighters, often optimized for lower-altitude dogfighting, found themselves gasping for performance as they climbed to meet bombers escorted at 25,000 feet. In these thin skies, the Mustang thrived. It could dive on its opponents, unleash 6 Brownings, then climb back to altitude before its prey had a chance to recover. For the Axis, combat increasingly felt like being stalked by an invisible predator. Stories circulated of Mustangs appearing seemingly from nowhere, diving out of the sun, tearing through a formation, and vanishing into the clouds. The laughter that once mocked the Mustang's appearance had long since died. In its place was a grim respect, tinged with fear. The psychological strain of fighting Mustangs cannot be overstated. Pilots are creatures of morale. They need to believe they can outfly, outfight, or outthink their opponent. But the Mustang shattered that belief. Italian squadrons, once proud of their aerial finesse, now flew with an undercurrent of dread. Every sortie carried the possibility that they would never return. The sound of 6 Brownings spitting fire became a harbinger of death. And yet, bravery remained. Italian aces, men like Luigi Guarini and Adriano Visconti, continued to take to the skies, determined to defend their homeland. They achieved victories, even in the shadow of overwhelming odds. Guarini, flying the Fiat G.55, downed multiple Allied aircraft and proved that Italian pilots could still strike hard. But each victory came at staggering risk, and more often than not, their squadrons returned with fewer men than they had left with. The Mustang also proved itself in adaptability. It wasn't just a high-altitude escort, it was a terror in low-level combat too. Strafing missions became a hallmark of Mustang operations in Italy. Airfields, trains, and convoys fell victim to the 6 Brownings. Italian pilots returning from missions often found their bases under attack by Mustangs diving in at treetop level, shredding parked aircraft before climbing away untouched. The once proud Regia Aeronautica not only lost battles in the air, but also its lifeblood on the ground. For civilians on the Italian home front, the sight of the Mustang overhead became both terrifying and oddly reassuring. Terrifying because it meant Allied power was close and their cities would soon be under attack. Reassuring because many Italians had grown weary of the war and Mussolini's promises. To them, the Mustang symbolized inevitability. The war was turning, and liberation, though destructive, was on the horizon. While on the Italian front, German pilots stationed in Italy echoed the sentiments of their Italian comrades. Veteran Bf-119 and FW-190 pilots, many scarred from years of combat, admitted that the Mustang was unlike any adversary they had faced. It wasn't just its technical superiority, it was the sheer number of them. American industry churned out Mustangs by the thousands, ensuring that for every Axis fighter in the air, there were multiple P-51s ready to meet it. By the summer of 1944, the Allied war machine was rolling across every front. In France, the Normandy invasion pushed German forces back toward their own borders. In the east, the Red Army was crushing divisions that had once marched with unstoppable confidence. And in Italy, the campaign was grinding its way northward through mountains, rivers, and fortified positions. In the skies above this brutal ground war, the Mustang reigned supreme. Italian pilots who had once prided themselves on daring maneuvers and quick reflexes now faced a cruel reality. The very style of dogfighting they had perfected no longer worked. The Mustang's speed and firepower didn't invite prolonged turning duels. Instead, it delivered lightning-fast strikes, high-speed slashing attacks that left no room for traditional combat artistry. Many Italian aces lamented that their skills seemed wasted. They were taught to dance in the skies, to weave through enemy formations with elegance, but the Mustang was a brawler with the heart of a predator. When its 6 Brownings opened up, elegance meant nothing. A single burst could disintegrate an opponent that had spent minutes trying to line up a perfect shot. The laughter that once filled Italian ready rooms had now been replaced by a heavier silence, interrupted only by the sound of pilots lighting cigarettes and staring at the floor. They still flew, still fought, but each man knew the odds. For every sortie, fewer returned. The Mustang wasn't invincible, no machine ever is, but its combination of speed, range, visibility, and firepower tilted the battlefield so heavily that survival itself became the Axis pilot's greatest victory. Accounts from Italian mechanics tell another side of the story. Many squadrons struggled with shortages of fuel, spare parts, and even ammunition. Against Mustangs that roared into battle with fully loaded tanks and magazines bristling with .5 caliber rounds, Italian fighters often went up half-armed or short on fuel. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecked aircraft just to keep a few machines airworthy. Some Italian pilots joked bitterly that they were flying on faith and scraps, facing opponents whose planes seemed fresh out of a factory line. And then there was the Mustang's versatility. It was not limited to bomber escort duties. Day after day, Italian roads and rail lines were strafed mercilessly. Trains carrying munitions erupted in fireballs. Convoys of trucks scattered as tracers stitched across them, and airfields were turned into graveyards of burning wreckage. Italian pilots often returned from their own sorties to find their bases attacked by Mustangs, the same aircraft that had hounded them in the air. The relentless nature of these strikes broke morale. There was no safe place, no refuge from the silver wings that hunted everywhere. For German units stationed in northern Italy, the story was much the same. Luftwaffe veterans had faced the Spitfire, the P-47, and even the Soviet Yak fighters, but many admitted privately that the Mustang was the most complete package of them all. It could dogfight, it could escort, it could strafe, and it could dive. Against such a machine, even experienced pilots found themselves fighting defensively more often than offensively.
By late 1944, the war in the air over Italy had become less about contesting the skies and more about surviving them. Italian pilots could no longer afford to joke about the Mustang. The days when they had mocked its looks were long past. Now they studied its silhouette obsessively, memorizing its angles and trying desperately to develop counter-tactics. Some attempted to lure Mustangs into turning fights, hoping their lighter aircraft could still outmaneuver the heavier American plane. Occasionally, it worked, but more often, the Mustang pilot simply refused to play that game. Instead, the P-51 used its speed to climb away, then swooped down again, dictating the fight on its own terms. The attrition was merciless. Every week, more Italian pilots were lost. For many, the first sign of the Mustang was also the last thing they ever saw. Survivors spoke of engagements that lasted seconds, a shadow above, the flash of tracers, and then nothing but fire and sky. Civilians began to notice the shift as well. Once, Axis propaganda boasted of Italian and German pilots holding the skies, keeping enemy bombers at bay. But as 1944 dragged on, Italian cities burned under relentless Allied raids. The Mustang, circling high above or streaking low across rooftops, became a visible symbol of that power. Children pointed upward in awe and fear, while families huddled in basements, praying that tonight's raid would not be theirs to endure. Within the Axis command, frustration boiled. Mussolini, now a puppet leader under German control in the Italian Social Republic, could promise little. His once proud Air Force was split, its resources dwindling, its pilots caught in a war they could no longer hope to win. Even German support could not change the tide. When squadrons took to the air, they knew they were flying into battles stacked against them. Historians later compared this period to a predator-prey relationship. The Mustangs were not merely aircraft, they were hunters. They sought out targets ruthlessly, struck with devastating precision, and vanished before their prey could recover. Italian pilots, once the hunters of early war years, found themselves reduced to prey, flying missions that felt like gambles against impossible odds. The transition from laughter to fear carried lessons that extended beyond Italy. Across Europe, the story was the same. The P-51 Mustang, underestimated at first, had become the hammer that smashed Axis air defenses. In Italy, where pride and artistry once defined the Regia Aeronautica, the lesson was especially harsh. Pilots who mocked the tractor with wings were humbled by the brutal efficiency of American engineering paired with British ingenuity. But even in defeat, Italian pilots earned respect for their bravery. Many continued to fight, even knowing the odds. They climbed into cockpits patched with spare parts, flew missions on dwindling fuel, and tried to protect their homeland as best they could. Against the Mustang, they stood little chance, but they flew anyway. In that, they found a different kind of honor. The Mustang's legend only grew. Allied pilots praised it as the fighter that could do it all. Ground crews marveled at its reliability. Bomber crews blessed its presence, watching Mustangs chase away attackers that once seemed unstoppable. And Axis pilots, Italian and German alike, whispered of it as the machine that turned the skies into a battlefield they could no longer claim. By early 1945, Italy's skies belonged entirely to the Allies. The Mustang had done its work. Rail lines lay shattered, factories silent, and Axis airfields littered with wreckage. The laughter of 1942 had become a distant memory, replaced by the silence of defeat. The Regia Aeronautica, once a proud force, had been reduced to fragments. The Mustang's 6 Brownings had written that story in fire and steel. In the end, the Italian pilots who had once laughed at the Mustang could only acknowledge its dominance. Many survived to tell their stories, and their words carried the weight of hard-earned respect. They spoke of a plane that at first seemed laughable, but in reality was unstoppable. They spoke of how the P-51's arrival marked the end of any hope for Axis air superiority in Italy. And they admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that the Mustang had earned its place as one of the greatest fighters in history.
The air battles over Italy in 1944 became a deadly chess match. For the Italian and German pilots, every sortie carried tremendous risk. Their radar coverage was patchy, fuel was scarce, and spare parts were almost impossible to come by. In contrast, the Allies had abundant resources, a steady flow of replacement aircraft, and pilots cycling through training schools at an industrial pace. The balance was lopsided, but bravery and skill on the Axis side meant the skies would never be without resistance. By now, Italian pilots were no longer mocking the Mustang. Instead, they were warning each other in grim tones. Se vedi la coda bolla, vai via subito. If you see the bubble canopy, get out immediately. That bubble canopy was the silhouette of the P-51D Mustang, the variant that had begun sweeping across Europe. Its sleek fuselage, powerful Packard-built Merlin engine, and 6 fast-firing Browning .50 caliber machine guns made it a predator unlike anything the Regia Aeronautica had faced before. Stories spread of squadrons decimated in minutes. One Italian pilot recalled a day when his flight of Macchi C.205 Veltros climbed to intercept a formation of bombers over the Po Valley. At first, it seemed like a routine mission. The plan was to dive onto the bombers, unleash cannon fire, and break away before escorts could respond. But before they could reach the American heavies, silver flashes cut through the sky. Mustangs were already waiting at altitude. The Italians fought bravely. One of them managed to squeeze off bursts at a B-17, claiming hits. But then the Mustangs dropped in and the world became chaos. Tracers from the P-51s shredded the thin skins of the Veltros, punching holes through cockpits and fuel tanks. Within 90 seconds, half the Italian formation was destroyed. Survivors limped back to base, shaken and pale. From that day forward, the joke about the Mustang being just another American plane was never heard again. The .50 caliber Brownings were often underestimated by enemy pilots, who considered them inferior to cannon. Indeed, a single 20mm cannon shell could tear apart a fighter if it hit squarely, but the Americans had perfected the art of volume fire. 6 Brownings firing in harmonized convergence could unleash a curtain of lead that no fragile Axis fighter could endure. Each second of trigger time poured out over 70 rounds. A short burst was enough to obliterate an engine block, sever a wing spar, or ignite fuel lines. Italian pilots quickly realized that their planes were simply not designed to withstand that kind of punishment. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs had a better chance of surviving a hit, but Italian fighters, though agile, were lightly built. A burst from a Mustang could slice them apart like paper. Survivors often describe the horror of seeing friends vanish in a bloom of fire within seconds. And yet, the Italians did not quit. They adapted. Some tried to use the element of surprise, taking off at dawn or dusk to avoid being intercepted. Others flew low-level attacks, hoping to strike Allied airfields or supply columns. A few even experimented with ramming tactics when ammunition was scarce. It was a desperate attempt to turn the tide, but the Mustangs were everywhere, patrolling, escorting, sweeping. Every time Italian pilots climbed into their cockpits, they carried the weight of near certain death, but they still flew, clinging to a sense of duty, pride, and the hope that perhaps one burst of cannon fire could bring down an enemy bomber. Yet the P-51 was relentless. Its endurance meant that American formations were never truly alone. Even deep inside northern Italy, the silver-winged hunters were waiting, engines snarling, guns ready. By late 1944, many Italian squadrons were shadows of their former selves. The war in the air was turning into a massacre. The once proud flyers who had laughed at the idea of the Mustang were now warning their recruits in hushed voices. If you see them, don't fight, just run. But running was not always possible, and when the Brownings opened fire, the laughter of 1943 was nothing more than a bitter memory. By the winter of 1944, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible: near total dominance of the skies over Italy. For Italian pilots still loyal to the Axis cause, the war had become an endless series of uphill battles. Every mission was shadowed by the presence of the P-51 Mustang, which seemed to appear from nowhere, striking with terrifying speed and precision. The Mustang's reputation was no longer a subject of mockery. It had become a name whispered with dread in briefing rooms and airfields. Italian commanders did their best to encourage their men, speaking of courage, sacrifice, and duty to the homeland. But the pilots knew the truth. Facing a Mustang in combat was almost a death sentence. In one grim encounter over the Adriatic coast, a flight of Fiat G.55 Centauros rose to intercept American B-24 Liberators. The Centauro was one of Italy's best late-war fighters, sturdy and well-armed. Its pilots believed they had a chance, until the Mustangs arrived. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Centauros fell one by one. A few managed to break away, but not before watching their comrades consumed by flames. The survivors returned to base with trembling hands, silent, their faces drained of color. The Allies had perfected a devastating tactic known as the fighter sweep. Long before bombers crossed into enemy territory, squadrons of Mustangs would surge ahead, clearing the skies of opposition. Italian pilots often scrambled only to find themselves ambushed before they could even reach altitude. The speed and climb rate of the P-51 gave it the edge every time. And when combat did come, the Brownings decided the outcome. The Mustang's pilots had learned to fire in short, deadly bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing destruction. One burst could send an Italian fighter spiraling into the earth. Sometimes entire formations were dismantled in minutes, the sky littered with burning wreckage. What stunned Italian survivors the most was the cold efficiency of their enemy. Mustang pilots didn't waste energy on taunts or unnecessary maneuvers. They struck fast, fired accurately, and moved on to the next target. It was war reduced to brutal simplicity, predator and prey. Yet despite the hopelessness, Italian pilots continued to fly. Pride in their squadrons, loyalty to fallen comrades, and a deep love of their homeland pushed them into the sky again and again. Some even found grim humor in their plight, joking that each mission was un biglietto di sola andata, a one-way ticket. The truth was undeniable. The P-51 had transformed the air war. What had once been a contest of skill and machinery had become a slaughter. The laughter of Italian pilots who once mocked the Mustang's arrival had been silenced forever, replaced by the roar of 6 Brownings tearing through their ranks. The Mustang had not just won the air war, it had reshaped the psychology of those who dared to face it. No longer just a plane, it had become a symbol of inevitability. And for Italian pilots, inevitability meant death from above.